Australian housing prices are in crisis. The residential space is becoming really heated and red ocean. What does that mean for an investor, even the first home buyer? It means that as the grants go up, so does the value of your property, the sale price of your property. So it becomes more and more unaffordable for the average Australian. If you're a new couple saving up to try to live in the same area you grew up in, it's almost impossible. So how do you combat that? Now, obviously there's also political changes that's happening at the moment, also for investors. So if you're an investor buying your second, third, fourth property, you're going to find there's different laws that's coming in different states to actually make it harder and less profitable for you to invest in residential. Now, some of these laws are like windfall taxes in Victoria, where if you originally thought you could invest in an area that's on the outskirts of Melbourne, and that might be rural land or farming land and it's going to be converted to residential land, now you've got a windfall tax when that converted. That applies to if you had a property that is low residential zoning, now it's going into high density zoning, you've got to pay that windfall tax. Well, that means all of these years that you've spent literally holding the property, negatively geared so that you're paying it down for the eventual gain in the future, is evaporating with all of these new government taxes, right? You're being squeezed from both sides. You have stamp duty coming in, capital gains tax when you sell, land tax while you hold the property, and now you've got more taxes like windfall tax, and soon the amalgamation of land tax around Australia, maybe potentially. When Queensland first brought it in last year, it killed the property prices, right? So now, what is the real next step for you moving forward? In this video, I'm going to share with you how in commercial property, you don't have all those things, and that it's actually cheaper to buy commercial properties in certain areas when you can't afford residential property. Now, this is really interesting because when you look regional, let's talk about regional properties for a second. When you look at regional, you're going to see small shop fronts, small office spaces, somewhere around 300,000, sometimes even 200,000, and going to about 400,000. So if you're under the $500,000 bracket and you want to stay in a relative metro area, you don't have to go to areas of Rockhampton, further out of the city in Townsville, go to Mackay, or go into regional Victoria to buy a less than $500,000 house, right? You can actually buy right now. You can go to the ACT and buy something in Metro for around $250,000. You go to Melbourne and buy a little office space for $250,000, right? So sometimes it's actually cheaper to buy commercial than it is residential, but most people don't realize it because they're not in the commercial space. Now, my name is Helen Tarrant. I've been teaching everyday Australians how to invest in commercial real estate since 2016. I've been utilizing strategies you would use in residential, converting it into commercial, and getting 10 times as much returns in just one property compared to your residential property. Now, how am I doing that? It's because I'm finding that out. There's gaps and keys and opportunities in the market that people are missing. For example, the drive to buy residential, accumulate residential so that you continuously have this growth in equity that you can draw down to buy the next one. It's a total fallacy because unless your income is going to grow by the same level of your equity, which it isn't, you are not able to draw down on that equity, and the equity is actually stuck until you sell it, and when you sell it, get hit with capital gains tax. So we have an issue, right? So how do you access that equity? The way to access that equity is to build in a cash flow asset, and voila comes commercial. Commercial is the cash flow asset, and commercial is the logical conclusion or the logical progress for you to go from residential to commercial, because you've got growth and cash flow if you don't balance the two out. And that's where the smart investors come in, is that they balance the two out so they can do more with their portfolio. So it's not dependent on them to support it. But they also realize when they want to get into a market and it's too expensive to buy residential, they can buy commercial. Now, I know there's a lot of naysayers out there, a lot of people, a lot of fear, because the commercial property is the unknown. And that's why here, Helen Tarrant, Unikorn Commercial Property, has helped everyday Australian demystify what exactly is commercial property. And our motto is about creating wealth together. So if you want to find out more about what we do, there's a link below that takes you through some education about what commercial property is about to get started, but also to make sure you get the book and get my book, because the book is going to help you demystify, give you step-by-step instructions on how to get started in commercial property. But if you want to join a community, you want to have your strategy laid out, and that's what we offer here at Unikorn. So make sure you click the link, book in for those relevant processes, and hopefully we get you started. But let's go back to how you can get commercial instead of residential in an area where it's too expensive. So I'm going to share with you some examples. For example, a couple of years ago, I bought a property in Chatswood. Now, this property in Chatswood, yes, it is not going to be positively geared, so we're comparing apples with apples. If I was to buy a house in Chatswood, Chatswood in Sydney, and we're looking prime Asian location, so a lot of Chinese investors are there. You're looking at, in the same area, just a couple of streets down, about 4.8 million. Now, I bought this commercial property for $2 million. Now, I know for the average investor that is really, really high, right? But $2 million a commercial property versus a $4.8 million house, that's a huge difference. But I've also seen in areas like, if I was to go to the ACT right now, I could buy a little shop for about 250 to 300,000, whereas I have to go, if I wanted to buy a house in the ACT, I'm somewhere around 5 to 700,000. So that's a big difference. Now, in areas of Townsville, for example, and we're looking at regional Queensland, you can buy a little commercial property for probably about $350,000. That's giving you positive cash flow from day one, even if you financed everything. But if you were to buy a residential, you're definitely looking somewhere between 3 to 500. So it's actually cheaper to buy commercial even in regional areas. Now, the smart investors are looking at their residential portfolio and thinking how I can blend in a commercial property so that we can keep going, so the cash flow from the commercial can support my residential as if it's a secondary income. Now, the most important thing to look at is that when you're planning out a property strategy, there's not just one way to it, there's multiple ways. So all roads lead to Rome. And the Rome is that you build a successful property portfolio that delivers you cash flow and growth on a year-on-year basis, right? And in order to do that, you have to do residential with commercial, but you have to do the right residential with the right commercial, right? Residential is really easy. You can find lots and lots of information, but commercial, it's really, really inhibited, and getting the right information means buying right versus wrong. So there's plenty of my other videos to check out if you wanted to invest, say, 500,000, a million, 250,000. There's some strategies around that, and that's really, really important for you to get started in your journey. But following on from there, the key things to remember is it is cheaper in many, many areas to buy commercial property than it is residential property. And I'm going to share with you some examples that I have in this video. But here's some quick examples. For example, this property here in Warri, this property is a little shop front for a client who can't afford more than 500,000. We actually found him something around $330,000, right? Now, if you bought a decent house in Cairns, you're going to be paying more than $330,000. This little property here in Townsville, it's about $350,000. If you bought a decent house in Townsville, or if you wanted to spend the same amount of $350,000, you actually would be way, way, way further out away, about 40 minutes from Townsville CBD, right? My property that I bought in Chatswood for $2 million versus a $4.8 million house. You can buy in Sydney CBD, you could buy a whole floor, or areas of North Sydney, you could buy a whole floor of office spaces for around $3 million, where the average house is going to be 5 or 6 or 7 million. Literally, there is cheaper commercial properties out there versus your residential properties. So if you think you can't afford residential, think commercial, because maybe the best way for you to get started is actually buying a commercial property versus a residential property. So my details are below. Don't forget to hit the bell, subscribe, and I will continue to share with you more things about commercial property. Let's create wealth together.